I'm Joshua Michael French, and you're listening to We Are One, You Are Two, a PlayStation podcast.
Welcome everyone to another episode of We Are One, You Are Two, a video game and PlayStation podcast. I'm your host, as always, Rob Fanzo. This is a PlayStation podcast where we talk about indie games, we talk about PlayStation, we talk about video games, sometimes we talk about other stuff as well. And again, I am Rob Fanzo. I'm joined today by Matt Rhodes, as always. Matt.
Heyo.
And also Joshua. Do you prefer Josh or Joshua?
You can call me Josh. That's perfectly fine.
We'll go with Josh Cadman.
As well as Josh French, but yeah.
Josh French. Oh, I'm sorry. Your email says Cadman, doesn't it?
It does.
Okay. My apologies. I don't know why I read that way.
Off to a good start, Rob. Off to a good start.
I know. It's pretty much par for the course. I explained that to my students this morning. It's pretty much what the end of my day is always like.
Yeah.
So guys, remember, if you like what you hear, you can go rate us foremost on iTunes. Go listen to us on Google Play, Stitcher, Patreon, Podbean, YouTube, everything else. We're here every week for you. We're going to talk a little bit today about, and the reason I have Josh on is because he is a handheld expert, in my opinion. So we're going to talk a little bit about Vita, which was in the news a couple weeks ago as being, or even a month ago, about being dead in the water, pretty much, with Japan stopping production next year. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Switch a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit about the PlayStation news as well, like we always do. Why don't we go ahead and kick stuff off with the news? Just talk a little bit about this. So this is our PS-N news. And Josh, I don't know how much you, like I said, we talked about this a little bit off air. Have you touched the new Spider-Man at all?
I have played it at a friend's house. I haven't gotten too deep into it myself, but I mean, it's an excellent game. There's no doubt.
Yeah, and so I just wanted to mention to both of you that Heist DLC is coming out pretty soon, actually. By the time we release this podcast, it should be out. I believe it's October 23rd. I don't know if you guys got a chance to see any of that, but they got 3 new suits.
Yeah, that did look cool.
Yeah, they did. And quite honestly, I'm pretty stoked about that, as well as just being able to play against or play with or have it focus on Black Cat as well. Because that was probably one of my favorite parts of the game, and probably one of the most underrated parts of the game too, because there's only 12 little items you could find with her. And then that was kind of really the end of her side quest. And so I'm kind of excited about that as well.
Female alternate characters and alternate costumes. You can't get much better than that.
No, I agree. And the costumes look good. So I'd love for them to do that with every DLC update, is just give us 2 or 3 new costumes. I would be totally happy. Because that was probably one of my other favorite parts of the game, was just being able to switch around between the different costumes as well. And so I wanted to mention that. The other news piece I wanted to mention I thought was really interesting this week, I don't know if either one of you saw this. I didn't know about this till somebody told me about it, was that the PS4 console issue where it was bricking consoles if you opened up a message. Did either one of you see that?
No. I had not heard that, actually.
So apparently, yeah, let me tell you real quick about this. PS4, basically, somebody was sending out a message, and from what I understand, you didn't have to do anything. If it popped up on your system, it would basically send them into a crash loop.
Wow.
And they would just go over and over again. They would crash.
Now that you say it, I remember seeing a few posts that make a lot more sense now.
I didn't know anything about it. They fixed it already, which is good. But apparently it was bricking consoles, or at least causing them to get into some sort of weird loop where they were crashing. So you said you saw messages?
Well, no, I mean, I saw posts about it on Twitter. I mean,
oh, okay.
But other than that, I didn't really read deep into it to figure out what the topic was. But now that you say that, that makes perfect sense. It was very meme-ish.
Yeah, I had no idea that was occurring until they actually fixed it. And then one of my students was like, "Oh, is your PlayStation okay?" Because he knows I'm a big gamer. And I said, "What are you talking about?" I had no idea that this stuff was crashing. So I'm not even sure how you do that. I guess that makes me a little weary that somebody's trying to put viruses or at least do something malicious with the PlayStation software, if that's even possible. And then the other big piece of news that I wanted to mention this week, and I kind of wanted both of your opinions on this. Did you guys see where Red Dead 2, where they had talked a lot about there was a bunch of senior employees who had worked over 100-hour weeks?
Yes. And I mean, of course, I think coming from the wrong place at the wrong time, that would have rubbed a whole lot of people the wrong way. I mean, I saw that people were like, why are you not treating this as a controversy that these guys were overworked just because it's a game that you're really excited for? If we heard about this coming from a company that didn't have the reputation, didn't have a game that everybody was so hyped for that it could really rub people the wrong way and get a bad backlash. And I think there's two different camps of thought with that. I'm not sure what you think. Yeah,
I tend to fall into the that same camp. I don't think that. I think if it was any other company, there would be way more backlash. It makes me think of the Telltale thing that's been occurring in the way that apparently they had a very toxic work environment and they were overworked, and then the company went under anyway. I think if it was any other company, it would probably been a bigger stink. But then people tend to look at Rockstar. It's kind of like Bethesda with the jankiness of their games. If it's another company, people really get on them about it, but everybody kind of accepts that. With Bethesda, they're like, yeah, it's Fallout 4. There's going to be weird glitches. It's really janky. You kind of look at that with Rockstar, and people were shocked by it, but then at the same time, they came out and clarified it was only certain employees who chose to do it. But I still think that any other company would have probably blown up even more as an unfair issue or problem. And I feel like people weren't making a big deal out of it. They were just like, oh, well, of course. What do you expect when they make Red Dead?
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like as long as they chose to do it, what's the big deal? You know what I mean? If it was something like they were locking them in at night and, forcing them to work overnight and all that kind of craziness, I could understand that. But, I'm sure they paid them. I'm sure it wasn't like thing, So, if someone needs the money or, is willing to put in that much hours for a couple weeks for, 3 weeks was the thing that I read about, only 3 weeks. I don't know. That'll be one fat paycheck. That'll be nice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you do have to consider the source. And if we don't see a history of employees reporting bad work environments or anything out of Rockstar, and I haven't personally, then maybe it's not a problem. If I was working on something like that I was truly passionate about, I might put 90 to 100 hours into it and just make it my life for that time that we were trying to wrap things up and really taking things seriously. But the problems that we've seen out of companies like EA or Konami having Orwellian work environments, that's a completely different story because there's a history there.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's funny too, because of all companies to allow employees to work that amount of overtime, I'm not shocked that it's Rockstar because, Grand Theft Auto 5 is just printing money for them at this point. You know what I mean? Like, they must have a thing in the basement that just, every time they make a sale, the cash probably just prints out like a printer because... they're constantly, Matt and I do a lot where we look at the charts and we look at, we talk about some of the top selling games every once in a while. And Grand Theft Auto 5's always in the top 10 every month. It doesn't matter how many games have come out that month. It's always in the top 10 for PlayStation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's like, who still needs a copy of this? And we've talked about that before, but who still needs a copy? Like, I know I sold mine back when it was on the PS3, but I haven't bought the PS4 version at all. And, maybe I'm one of those, maybe there's a bunch of people like me that did that. But I just can't believe that they're still selling copies of it. I would love to know what the attach rate is. Like if you compare that to, it's got to be 1 in 3, something like that, owns GTA at this point.
Maybe, but one thing that I have seen with PlayStation is that they have lower adoption rates if you look at the entire install base, and I think that's somewhat natural if you see that there's 80 million people in the world that have a PlayStation 4.
Yeah.
But adoption rates tend to be far lower on PlayStation 4 than they do on, say, Switch, and that's not a disparity against PlayStation because if you look at the same metrics on Xbox, Xbox One, especially, adoption rates for specific titles are actually lower, probably about half at least on Xbox One. And I'm talking about percentage of their entire install base. So it doesn't matter that there's a huge difference in the number of units that's, out there in the wild for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. Adoption rates tend to be higher on PlayStation 4, but still not nearly as high as, say, Switch is the hot new kid on the block,
Yeah. And Switch too, I know there were some exceptions with that too, because I can't remember when it first came out. Maybe it was Super Mario, or maybe it was the new Mario Odyssey that the adoption rate. I can't remember if it was that game or if it was.
I think it was the tennis. I think it was Mario Tennis Aces that was a little bit lower.
Okay, no, there was one I'm thinking of that was like a 98% attach rate, and it was the beginning of the Switch's life. Yeah, the beginning of the Switch's life cycle, and it was like, well, of course it's going to be that. You've got like 4 games for it right now.
Exactly.
Care about.
No, it was extreme. It was stupid in the beginning because you had Zelda that actually had a higher attach rate than the number of systems that were out there. It was like 105, 100%, 110%, something like that. But it was because people were buying 2 copies in some cases, or buying copies when they hadn't even been able to get a system, because Nintendo didn't have enough out in the wild. And that's nuts that people were actually pre-purchasing the game just hoping that they'd be able to get a system.
Yeah. It's just interesting to me, the whole Rockstar Grand Theft Auto. And I don't know. I'll be curious to see if Red Dead hits that same level of success or not, because I feel like it's a little bit more niche with its audience, appealing to, a Western, people who enjoy Westerns. I don't see the same level of support there, maybe. So we'll see. Last but not least, I got 2 short other stories. They're both PSVR, and then I have a Vita one that'll lead us into our topic here. But first off, I don't know if you guys saw that PSVR owners are being gifted $10 store credit because it is PSVR's birthday. The past 2 weeks, they've been kind of celebrating it. And so I guess if you were an early adopter, I don't know how they determine that. Maybe it's when you buy the games. A lot of people are receiving a $10 discount code for the PlayStation Store. So it's just a nice little nod from PlayStation for people for that.
Does that apply to you, or is that?
I don't think I was early enough.
Oh, okay.
Because I didn't get it, so I'm going to assume not. Because it says it expires October 23rd.
You did make the cut.
I didn't make the cut, so that's why I said it had to be early adopters.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if it's what, 2 years old, I believe this year, PSVR.
Yeah,
and
2 years.
I think I bought into it about a year into its life cycle, a little over. So I guess probably within that first year, they probably looked back. They probably, and I'm sure it had to do with something with purchasing on the store or something like that.
Sure.
Last but not least, and so the other thing I'll mention regarding that is apparently No Man's Sky still VR support being mentioned and talked about in a recent survey that Hello Games sent out, and that might actually get me back into that game if they did VR support.
That would be neat.
That would be really awesome. So we'll see about that. And then the last story that I did want to just mention briefly here, this kind of ties us into what we're going to talk about with the Switch and Vita. Halloween Forever made news this week, which I'm not familiar with that. I guess it's a cutesy 8-bit platformer, according to Push Square. It's coming to PS4 and PS Vita, or should be out by the time you're listening to this. Yep. It stars Pumpkinhead. I don't know if you've checked this out at all. It looks ridiculous. So I'm kind of excited to try it out. But that made news this week for whatever reason, that it was bringing the holiday spirit to PS4 and PS Vita. And so there's not much Vita news out there that's on mainstream websites. So I was kind of excited to see that, I guess.
Well, right. You throw anything out there right now that's Vita, and the Vita Island community latches onto it just like a rabid dogs, because, we don't get enough stuff on the Vita. We have to fight tooth and nail for every game that comes out. And whenever we get a surprise, it just blows us over because, we all keep up with the news very closely. We know what kind of stuff is in development and what may or may not come to the system. So whenever we get hit with a surprise, it's a big deal. Of course, this is digital only, and we tend to prefer, as collectors, physical release. But who knows? A lot of the big indies that have done well digitally have been coming physically.
Yeah. And so let's go ahead and move into our topic of conversation here. Matt, you and I both own a Vita.
We do, yeah.
Josh is a huge proponent of handhelds. And so actually, since we're getting into that, Josh, why don't you tell us a little bit about why you consider yourself such a handheld aficionado? What's kind of gotten you into, or has always been kind of the handheld, why you've always been into that stuff? And then you also can maybe plug your channel a little bit too, so that we know who we're dealing with here.
my half non-existent channel.
That's what I call ours too, half non-existent.
Well, I mean, I've always had a huge affinity for handhelds, going all the way back to the original Game Boy. I actually am in a record book, a Twin Galaxies record book, for being one of the only people in North America to finish Mega Man 2 on Game Boy. And I had like a reporter come out to my house when I was a teenager and say, like, "You're in this record book." And I was like, "What?" So, like, you know, even back in the late 80s and early 90s, I was already getting into handhelds. Things really kind of escalated for me, though, whenever PSP came out, because it was the first time that we had, you know, a handheld PlayStation, and it was promising a true console experience in your hands. It really excited me, and I went into that 2 feet, you know, full force, because I planned on getting every single release. It was the first time I'd ever done that. I got it on launch day, which was not an unusual thing for me for any system. And I was already such a big PlayStation nut, but I'm a bit of an omni gamer. I like to play pretty much anything, but a few weeks into collecting PSP, I realized, okay, there's a lot of stuff that I'm buying just to have everything on PSP. So I'm going to back off of this a little bit. I still ended up with like 165 PSP games over its lifespan. Wow. And I mean, that really instilled in me that I had, I don't know, I had more of an identity as a gamer with PSP than I had in a while, because as things got more advanced with PS2 and then PS3 and now PS4, I've just gotten a little bit disenchanted with AAA development. It's not that I don't like a good AAA game. I like the new Spider-Man. I like The Witcher, Mass Effect, Assassin's Creed, Elder Scrolls, things like that. But I grew up in the 8-bit and 16-bit era. And back then, it was shoestring budgets, not multi-million-dollar budgets. It was small teams having to really do the most that they could with very little to work with. Of course, you thrived off of originality and really thinking outside the box and presenting really solid gameplay and narrative. And I think that presentation trumps everything these days on AAA development with consoles. You've got 800-person teams working on a multi-million-dollar project, and of course you're going to end up something that looks gorgeous. A lot of times the narrative is great. I mean, on par with some of the stuff that we get in movie theaters, or even better. That's where the strength of AAA development lies, and you got PlayStation that just rocks it with exclusives. So you get a lot of really good stuff on PlayStation 4 especially. But as the generations went by with PSP and then eventually I got into Vita, I just noticed that it wasn't the tone of game that really got me going, that really got my passion going. And I liked the smaller projects. I liked the idea of developers still having to be right sized for development on a handheld, because it felt more like that classic development. They were having to work with smaller budgets and really think out of the box to create something that was original and that they were passionate about. And it wasn't about following a cookie cutter formula to appease the largest, broadest audience that you possibly can. I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as PSP kind of tapered off, and it went through much the same life cycle that Vita did, but less so, because there was more of an adoption rate for PSP. So it hasn't gone through quite the struggles that Vita has. Vita still has a lot of users out there, millions, but they don't touch the PSP install base. So you didn't see the first party support, and in some cases you didn't see the same kind of third party support. But I rolled right into Vita the same way that I did PSP, where I just loved handheld games at that point, but it coincided with a lifestyle change where my mother-in-law was actually staying with us from Japan for about 7 months. You may not know, Matt, my wife is Japanese. She's a citizen. She's a permanent resident in the U.S. And my mother-in-law was staying with us while she was pregnant with our daughter. My daughter's about to turn 7 years old. So it gives you kind of a reference of time here. Yeah. And that's about when the Vita was coming out, right? So I got the Vita, and it just so happened that around that time of my life, I couldn't use the TV for anything. I mean, my mother-in-law was using it for stuff. I had TV Japan running for them. My daughter got a little bit older, and she was watching Disney Junior and everything. So the TV became just locked out to me entirely. Well, fortunately, the PS4's launch meant that immediately, within 15 minutes of having that thing unboxed, I had it on remote play. So, I mean, I've got a rock solid remote play set up in the house so that I can play all my PS4 games remote play. I am die hard when it comes to that setup. It's something that you mentioned my YouTube channel. I do have a new YouTube channel. It doesn't have a whole lot of videos added to it yet, called The Remote Player, because that's been my kind of calling card. I really champion remote play, and the fact that it's a lifestyle solution that allows you to be in the same room as your wife and daughter and participate in the conversation, but you have a handheld game that's allowing you to play either your classic PSP games digitally, your Vita games, your PS4 through remote play, anything. You can do it right there through the Vita. And that was a lot of the passion right there with the Vita, was being able to do everything in one spot. I mean, it had PS1 classics on it too. Great stuff. But then, I mean, then I encountered the community, including you, Rob. And the community for Vita is ridiculously cool. Everybody's so passionate about the system. And, nothing brings people together like adversity. And since the Vita has been abandoned by Sony for the most part, then the people who had similar experiences to me and really got into Vita and loved it, thought it was a beautiful and powerful handheld, responsive touchscreen, everything that they really wanted in a system like that. And they can use it for remote play on their console for a lifestyle solution. I mean, it really gets people passionate about the hardware, and seeing it neglected like that makes you even stronger in that opinion. So the community all kind of felt that way. We all go through similar struggles. That shared experience is a big part of it. I know what you go through because I go through it on a day-to-day basis too, So you just saw Vita take off with support for indies that were mostly going to Vita because it was a platform that made sense for them. It was not overblown budgets and everything that could compete on the system. So indies were coming over to Vita. As a result of that, Kickstarters that got to be a big thing during the Vita's lifespan. Vita was becoming the number one stretch goal for just about any indie development, because the Vita community would always come out and support them launching on Vita. They knew that they would have a built-in fan base. Sure, it may have seemed limited to the few million that really championed it, but I mean, that's still strong as a baseline community for an indie developer. So the Kickstarters were a big thing, and it's all history from there. We've just hung in there as long as we possibly can. We've got the backing of companies like Limited Run Games and East Asia Soft that continue to release physical Vita games well into 2019, really pushing it to the end of the production lifespan. I mean, I guess you already know that Western production for physical game cards comes to an end in March. And then later in the year, it'll come to an end in Japan and Asia. So we know that time is coming near, but we're pulling every ounce of energy left out of the system, whether Sony wants us to or not. I mean, Sony stepped away from this thing early, within the first year or two. Really, they had one lawsuit over false advertising regarding remote play and what it would allow you to do, and then decided that they weren't getting enough out of their AAA development on it, like Killzone, and they stepped away from it and decided this is not going to do what we want it to. So there will be no more AAA development for the system. And they slowly started killing off things and just kind of ignoring problems. And it was sad because I know that there were people within Sony that did a good job of bringing indies to Vita and doing things to really keep it alive. But for the most part, third-party development is what kept it alive. The fans are what kept it alive. You know, if those hadn't been there, then even those few people in Sony that really helped out in that regard wouldn't have been in that position.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's interesting to me. I know, Matt, you and I bought ours probably back in like 2012, I think, 2011, something like that.
Yeah. It was a Black Friday deal.
Special. Yeah, I remember that.
Came with Assassin's Creed Liberation.
Yeah. And I think I actually use my Vita more now over the past year than I have, or 2 years even, than when it first came out or when I first got it. And I think it is Sony made, even though Sony abandoned it, as you mentioned, Josh, what I find interesting is that they still made smart moves with it, with the remote play, allowing the PS4 to have remote play with it 2 years later, right, in 2014. Opening up that door, I think, is actually what benefited them with the community, because that allows, like you said, that allows somebody like yourself, or I know I use that a lot too, to still enjoy a PS4 game, but to be able to enjoy it anywhere, right? That you can have a strong enough connection, especially in your own house like that. I think they gave up when they saw that it wasn't selling like they wanted. And I think they gave up because I think at that time they probably started working on the VR stuff, and they realized that was a different potential. And they had soft sales for Vita at that point. And they thought, well, maybe we'll take this direction. And of course, I think Switch coming out has made a lot of people question, shouldn't Sony kind of dive back into this? But I don't know that, even with the PSP, I don't think they ever found their footing the way that they had hoped.
Well, my argument for the successor for Vita for years now has been that Sony doesn't need to create another handheld that they're going to potentially abandon. There's a huge fan base for Vita. What I think they should have done was create kind of a third model, kind of a 0.5 generation of the Vita that was more like a PlayStation Vita Pro, like a PSVP. Kind of combines the ideas of the original PSP that was the most popular handheld with the PlayStation Vita, and give it all the same controls as a PS4. So you got 4 triggers, you got clickable analog, things like that. I know it's a pipe dream, but to give it a little bit better hardware, a little bit bigger screen, higher resolution OLED, and pump it up just enough to where it gives a little bit of upscaling to the existing library, and use that heading in, well, not only as companion hardware for the PS4 Pro, which would have been the genius behind my marketing idea, right? But also to set that up as your remote play solution for PS5. Now I'm concerned about what they're really going to do. Now I've heard whispers of a tablet device coming out with PS5. Will that end up being some sort of incarnation or spinoff of what I'm talking about? Maybe, but all that is just in the rumor stage, and I don't expect Sony to get back into the handheld market with a new library. I haven't really even recommended it because I don't think they'll handle it well.
No.
But I do think they could have done a better job of maybe giving like a 0.5 extension to the generation that continued to run digital PSP games, PlayStation 1 games, Vita games, kind of as your backwards compatibility solution too, because they've been criticized so heavily for their lack of backwards compatibility on PlayStation 4. So if you had that in like a PSVP concept, then you would have full backwards compatibility for a lot of your library. They could do more PS2 on PS4 titles. They could even amp up the idea of being able to do PS Now for PS3 games, that sort of thing. Like, you really could push that in a way that the market would see it in a different light, and it wouldn't just be a repeat of the Vita struggles. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I'd be curious, and with PS5, I do, I haven't heard that rumor about the tablet, but that would be very interesting to me because I do think Sony has to address that backwards compatibility issue. And I do think that allowing people to have PS Now and download certain games to the system, kind of the way Microsoft has their Game Pass now, that they're allowing them to do that. I think that that's them taking a step in that direction. I do think PS5 will have backwards compatibility. I do agree with you on the Vita. I don't think they'll ever do the handheld space again, but I do think if they would release some sort of tablet in conjunction with that and kind of say, okay, it works through Bluetooth with your controller, I think that will be like and it's portable, it can connect to the PlayStation anywhere as long as you have Wi-Fi signal. I wonder if that would be kind of their small solution to like, here's this Vita crowd that wanted another handheld, and we can't quite give you another handheld, but we'll give you something that's halfway between a handheld and halfway between a Nintendo Switch.
Right. And, it's funny. I know you've seen a lot of the stuff that I post on Twitter, so you may already know this, but I actually remote play my Xbox One as well. I don't do it on a Vita, though. I use a GPD Win, which is like a handheld Windows 10 laptop. It's literally the size of a 3DS, and it has a built-in Xbox controller, and it's a full Windows 10 laptop, but it's just small. And you can install Steam games directly to the hardware. You're not streaming when it comes to Steam games or Origin. So I'm talking about, I actually have the entire original Mass Effect trilogy that I can play handheld anywhere I go because it's installed on the hardware and it's running through Origin. The same with Steam games. I've got things like Lightning Returns, Final Fantasy 13, or the Prince of Persia from PS3 or something like that I'll kick up on there. And that's a cool device. But what a lot of people hadn't realized was that as a Windows 10 machine, you could use the Xbox app to stream from your Xbox One. So I also, it's rock solid. It uses a standard protocol for the wireless. So it's really rock solid, and you can play any of the backwards compatible stuff too. So like Panzer Dragoon Orta or Fable 2 or something like that, I'll be playing handheld in the house too. So it's just about that portability for me. And it doesn't matter if it's streaming within the house. That's something. It's not like Sony can really provide us the infrastructure we would need to be able to do it truly anywhere. But I don't get that from the others either. The only one that gives me that is the Switch, because it's a hybrid and you're actually sticking the game into the console and taking it with you. So I'm not expecting too much out of Sony. I really don't think that they're going to do that with PS5. I don't think you're going to be able to take your games physically with you anywhere.
No.
But if they have some sort of remote play option, then you've at least satiated me. That's going to be what I'm looking for. If I can't remote play or off-screen play my PS5 in some way, I'm going to have a hard time with that, because it's going to feel like I'm regressing back to an earlier state.
Right. Matt, what about you? Do you think, because you don't do a whole lot of remote play or worry about that kind of stuff, because when you're gaming, you're pretty much in your place, right? You don't worry about that on your way to work or on your way to or from work, or when you're going out somewhere, correct?
Yeah, that's kind of been my hesitation with even like purchasing a Switch, is that I don't do a lot of mobile gaming. Because most of the time being in Chicago, I'm just on the bus or the train.
What's wrong with you? That's a perfect reason to get one.
I know. Well, I know. It's a perfect time, but I don't want to take it to work. I'm a server. It's a restaurant. I don't want to have to deal with worrying about it getting stolen or, you know what I mean? Like, it's just...
We're leaving it on the bus.
Yeah, exactly. There's just too many things that can go wrong, I feel like.
Yeah.
In transit or, at the destination once I get there. That would be the issue. And to me, that's the problem.
Well, it's actually quite the opposite for me, because my commute is about 30 minutes and it's me driving. So I don't really get an opportunity to play while riding a bus or train or anything like that. The only time I've practically ever done that with one of my handhelds was when I'm visiting Japan, because they obviously have a much better public transportation system than where I am.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. We don't get much in the South transportation.
Yeah, but it's opposite with me. I always take my Vita, my 3DS, and my Switch, like in neat little carrying cases in my backpack with my laptop and everything, and they go with me everywhere, and I never play them anywhere but my house. It's not that I don't ever, but you know what I mean. It's very rare.
Sure.
I don't get many opportunities outside of the house to play the handheld. So, it might be counterintuitive to some people. They may not be able to picture themselves playing something handheld in the house. Why not just use the big screen? But that's opposite of my philosophy.
And I think too, it's living situation, right? Because like you said, you're with family, and so you're doing that. And I know, like Matt, you don't have to worry about that per se. You and I technically, in some ways, don't have to worry about that, right? We don't have kids. We don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. Not yet, anyway.
Just wait.
Yeah. And my Vita, I carry it I'm kind of like you, Josh. I carry mine everywhere with me, but very rarely do I actually pull it out other than when I'm at home. I did go camping a couple weeks ago, and it was great to have that in the tent. But that was really about the only time it's gotten use outside of the house. And so I would be curious to see what Sony does in the future. And I thought this was an interesting topic. I heard this somewhere else earlier in the week. I don't think that no matter what, I don't think that the next set of consoles, and this kind of ties in with the remote play idea, I don't think games will be streaming only. I think you'll still be able to purchase them digitally or physically, because I can't imagine people being able to have an internet connection that's strong enough everywhere, even in their own households, to allow for streaming only. Because I know we do have PS Now and we do have Xbox Game Pass, and I know a lot of people see that as the future. I'd be kind of curious on both of your thoughts on that. I just don't see where those two become dominant. They're more like an accessory for somebody who can't afford it. I think there's too many people without internet connections to create a streaming only device.
Well, think for a second on what we've gone through with PlayStation 4. And I think that this generation, more than the last two, have been affirmation that we still need physical games and digital downloads of stuff that don't rely on that connectivity. And I don't think it's because we won't ever reach that infrastructure that we need to be able to play things streaming. I think we're closer now than we ever had before, but I just don't think it's the way that enough people prefer to consume their entertainment. I mean, we appreciate it when we can download something and not have to worry about like, oh, it's buffering, or whatever. There's always like performance hits that you have to deal with, even when you do have a decent network setup. So I don't think it's the way that serious gamers like to play, but you also have a huge group of collectors out there that just generally don't care for digital only for a lot of reasons. We've seen that eventually things may get delisted from stores. We don't know what kind of account management is going to carry over to the next console. So I've seen a lot of regret from people that have gone digital only and decided that was a bad move on their part. How much worse would it be if you were relying completely on streaming? So you don't have as much of a collection to show for it. And some people will see that as a convenience, but if there wasn't validity to that keep it physical kind of argument, then you wouldn't have seen the rise of so many companies that are based on the same concept as limited run games. You got Special Reserve out there, Super Rare Games, East Asia Soft, all these companies that are completely centered on preserving games physically, and they sell out 100% of the time. And I think that the mentality has just moved a little bit away from that, especially since the storage capacity on these systems hasn't really supported full digital anyway. And streaming wouldn't have that problem. But don't you think it's kind of part and parcel to one another?
I think so. Yeah, I'd agree. Matt, what do you think about that? I mean, do you think we'll see more of a shift towards digital? Because I can see a shift towards digital. I can't see a shift towards streaming. And so I don't know. What are your thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with you, Rob, on the digital aspect of it, but not the streaming, because I mean, there are so many things that stream now, right? I mean, you can stream through GameFly. You can, I mean, even just the normal like TV stuff, like as far as like Netflix and Hulu and all that stuff, and that's kind of like where the culture is going, I think, to a certain extent. But I think as far as gamers, I feel like they want the best experience they can get. And because of that, I don't think streaming is the way to go with them. I mean, we were talking about, people in the household would most likely rather just play on their big TV. Well, that's because all of these new systems are geared towards the better graphics, right? Like I have a UHD TV, like I have a 4K TV that can pump out the amazing graphics that these systems are pumping out. So why not play on something that's going to even look that much better, right? So I think when you get into the streaming, and then even 4K streaming is very limited right now, with like Netflix and Hulu and stuff like that. I mean, some of that stuff is just very basic for what they're doing, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes. But I feel like as far as the gaming community, it will be more digital rather than streaming.
Yeah, well, I think you actually make a good point, though, Matt, because you said it'll be tough trying to stream 4K games because you need that much more bandwidth. Well, won't it always kind of be that way where even if we get better streaming technology, there's always going to be video technology that's that much further ahead and demands that much more bandwidth, so we never truly catch up?
Yeah, it's true.
I mean, that's the way I see it. I mean, I just feel like there's always going to be a little bit of a slide rule there where you can't fully catch up. It's like a handheld trying to catch up to a console. Mm-hmm. You know, you might get a full console quality experience out of a Vita, but it's not quite PS4. You know, you could get better than PS2, maybe even sometimes as good as PS3, but it's always going to be a little bit behind. I think you'll deal with similar problems with streaming technology versus video technology.
Yeah. Nintendo always stepped behind, right? And so it'd be the same way with that. And that's interesting to think about in that regard too, because when you look at, you know, where we're going with 4K, and I know I've seen some stuff about 8K as well. You know, you don't have the infrastructure with an internet to be able to handle that stuff now, let alone if you make the next consoles continue to push that visual fidelity higher and higher. And the other thing too, I think, is like you mentioned before, Josh, there's a huge collection of people who like the physical stuff, because the most important thing about when you're doing something streaming or when you did download digitally, and I know I'm guilty of this, you're basically licensing that game.
That's right.
They decide to pull that off the store tomorrow, and you will no longer have access to that game. And it's happened with several games already. Mm-hmm. And I know Deadpool's one that's a good example. Some of the Marvel games are. Every time the licensure, or the Turtles game, the Ninja Turtles game that got taken off the store because the licensure was up. And so they had to remove it digitally. Now, if you had it physically, you're fine. But I don't know that the majority of people think about that, because I just read something where this Call of Duty that just came out, the digital sales were up a certain percentage. And for once, it outsold it physically. The physical sales had dropped like 15% or something along that line, and digital sales went up like 30% higher than last year on this Call of Duty. And so I do think your average Joe isn't thinking about that licensing factor, or that what happens when they pull it from the store, or if they were streaming games too, and it's like Netflix. Well, you guys have Netflix, I'm sure, or you know that sometimes a title disappears off Netflix because it's at Netflix's control.
Yeah, they have a cycle.
Right.
Yeah. And so what happens if gaming, you know, we have streaming gaming and we have a cycle, and they go, well, you know what, this month we'll take Dead Cells off because, you know, nobody's streaming it right now, or there's a lesser population streaming it. And, you know, they decide not to put it back on or whatever. So I do see a lot of inherent risks with streaming, or even just the downloading digitally thing, even though I'm guilty of half my PS4 library is digital because I'm just too lazy to get up and not change the disc.
Well, I totally agree with you too, Rob, because, I mean, I don't think that the mainstream audiences think about it that way. I do think that they think digital is much more convenient, and that they don't care about collecting the games, and they don't really want to go back to previous generations to play older games. They want to play all the new stuff. And I get that mentality, and that's fine. Those mainstream consumers drive a lot of what happens in the technology. But my point is not that my type of gamer, the collectors and the ones that want everything physically, you know, for not only for collectability, but for archiving and always having that license to play it. Like you said, I don't think that we're the majority anymore. I think that we are becoming more and more a minority. But my point is that we're still a backbone of what gets done in the industry, and that our voice is still strong enough that there will be reason to do those things. But I realize that there's going to be new games that I want to play every generation, but there's also, for every one of those, there's going to be like a Chrono Trigger or a Persona that I want to go back to and put in my system and play. I mean, I've got 42 game systems that are active. I can get in there. I can walk 10 feet into my game room right now, turn on the Sega CD and play an old Sega CD game, and that's just how I roll. I want to be able to access all of my games, and I want all the content archived physically so that I never have to argue with account management over whether or not I have the right to play it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And the one thing I never understood that people do is they get rid of their old hardware systems. I don't think I've ever gotten rid of a hardware system. I just refuse to. Because there are games that perhaps I want to go back and visit, and maybe I don't ever have time to, but I like having the option.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of what makes Vita's collectability so attractive too, is just because, I mean, I don't know if you know this, I've got like 254 Vita games at this point, and they're just all in these little small blue cases. And they're so easy just to stack like a billion of them in a shelf and be able to pull them out and play them. And they've got tiny little cards that don't get in the way of anything. It's convenient. And it's so quick and easy just to pop that thing in the system. It finds itself in your installed directory and you're off to the races. And you can put it on suspend anytime your 7-year-old comes up to you and says, "Daddy, I need something," or whatever. It's just convenient. And PS4, even playing a PlayStation 4 game on the TV, it's not that convenient. It does have suspend, but it's kind of a pain, and it never really works right, it seems like. Yeah. There's more of a commitment there to be able to put a disc in a system and let it load. But now I'm getting on another handheld rant, because that's what I do.
Hey, nothing wrong with that. Trust me, I understand. I don't know. I don't know if there's anything else I really wanted to cover with handhelds or with the kind of general. I think this has been a good conversation. It's been good to kind of pick your brain, Josh, and talk a little bit about that stuff, because I know Sony does listen. Like you said, I thought you made a really good point. Sony does listen to the minority sometimes, because when I look at there were not 80 million people screaming for Crash Bandicoot to be remade.
That's right.
There was not. There was not. Just like. I don't care about Spyro the Dragon, right? There's not 40 million people asking for that trilogy to be remastered. And so Sony does listen to the hardcore fans. And I think the hardcore ones are the ones that still use their Vita, who still engage in the ecosystem of the PS4 and the Vita regularly. And, I would like to see them listen to that at some point. I mean, they clearly... The PSN name changes, I think, is a perfect example. The vast majority that we were talking about do not care about PSN name changes, but the PS hardcore people do. And so they finally, I can't imagine what took them so long, but that's beside the point. They listened to them and they got there. And so, I'd like to think that PS Vita people still make enough noise over the next year, right? And the other thing, too, is maybe Sony will notice this. The prices on eBay and other places for a Vita, once they stop production, I guarantee you will skyrocket.
Yeah.
You'll see $400, $500, $600 for a Vita. I already found them on eBay for $1,200.
Well, and I think one of the biggest things that's going to push Sony to do something, and I don't know what it's going to be. I really don't think it's going to be what Vita fans want, frankly. But they've got to see the impact that Switch is having right now and know that they could have turned Vita into something closer to that if they had just played it a little bit differently, at least in my mind. Yeah. Now, that said, you will never hear me call the Switch, as much as I advocate it, you will never hear me call the Switch a replacement for Vita. Yes, it is a handheld capable device, but it's not as small and portable as the Vita. The Vita has a little bit more of the multi-function stuff of playing your backwards compatible stuff than Switch does. It's not a true replacement. But what you will hear me say is that the developers and the fans that really, really pushed on Vita, the Switch does serve a purpose as a successor to that, because we may not get something from Sony. And because Sony's the one that walked away from Vita, I don't think that there should be any fanboyism of saying that, you're betraying the Vita by also liking Switch. I mean, if you see any of the stuff that I post pretty equally for Vita and Switch these days, even though Vita is technically on its way out the door, and I still love it. I treat them as equals in a lot of regards, but the Switch fan base is growing in a lot of the same way that Vita Island has. I launched the Switch Core community not too long ago, it was about a month ago, and we've already had a tremendous uptick of people participating in that. And we see a lot of the same things that were happening with Vita Island as far as us advocating for certain indie games to come to Switch and release physically, that sort of thing. We've built relationships with limited production companies and attended conventions and done all these things to try to build up Switch Core in a lot of the same way, out of respect to the community that I always interacted with Vita Island. So I think the two can coexist, but they're not the same thing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does. Matt, I just need to know, does all this talk make you want to dig that thing back out?
I mean, a little bit, yeah. I mean, it's not that I'd have to dig it out. It's
sitting there.
It's right on my bedstand.
What thing? The Vita or the Switch?
The Vita.
The Vita.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's right on my stand. I mean, it's not like it would be hard to do. But maybe that's a solution for if I move in with my girlfriend, is to maybe if we only have one TV, then I can just remote play what I need to play on PS4. So I mean, I don't know, but I mean, I don't see myself getting rid of it. I mean, unless I can get $1,200 for it. I mean, I can't really pass that up either. But I do like it. I mean, as a handheld, I think they did a good job with it, but as far as handhelds go, I think just Nintendo just knows. They've been doing it for so long. You know what I mean? Because they don't necessarily care about graphics. They don't necessarily care about, the 4K kind of a thing. They just, they know their fan base. They know that they're more family oriented and geared towards, a younger audience as a generality. But you still have obviously the gamers who have been there since the beginning, because we're that old now. But yeah, I just think that they just do it. They do it so well that it's hard to compete with that. So anything anyone puts out, Sony, Xbox, whoever, it's always going to be compared to a Nintendo handheld because they just know what they're doing.
Well, and I think you're absolutely right. That Nintendo knows their niche. They will go this hybrid route. They'll consolidate their entire production pipeline into this one system that consolidates handheld and console, which is interesting because they haven't been focused on a single platform since the late 80s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they're concentrating all their efforts there. They're trying to get the mature gamers over to the Switch. And even though it's a very powerful handheld, it's not as powerful as PS4 and Xbox One, and it doesn't claim to be. Although it still has gotten a fair amount of parallel development. Even, most recently I played Dragon Ball FighterZ on Switch and was just blown away by the fact that it felt every bit as good as the PS4 version. That was crazy, but not every game works that way. You couldn't run
right.
Red Dead on it.
Right.
But it's still a very powerful system, but it's behind the technology of PS4 and Xbox One in that regard. And it's very unapologetic in the way that it does that. By that same token, PS4 knows that it can push forward with the higher tech. It can go with the 4K or 8K or 16K or Real K or whatever they end up doing next, and push forward with VR. And they can be the cutting edge of technology. Microsoft always prides itself in trying to get a leg up on power of the system, even if their system ends up being bulky and crazy looking. And that's the battle, is that Nintendo has taken itself out of the competition. They're just like, we have our own niche. Y'all battle it out. And I was kind of thinking that Microsoft might bow out of the next generation, but it doesn't look like it anymore. I didn't even think about this. You said that you and Matt look at charts and metrics a whole lot on these things and sales. I didn't realize until recently, maybe, because PlayStation 4 has 81 million in console sales at this point for PS4.
Yeah.
But in North America, the two, Xbox One and PS4, are only separated by a couple million. in North America.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, Xbox One is stinking all over the planet other than North America, but in North America, in its home market, the two are very close, much closer than I thought they were. So that's an interesting number.
Yeah, it is. And it's something that's often reported because, well, you hear that PlayStation sold almost 3 times the amount of Xbox. And that's a big reason is globally they're able to, right? Europe, they do all right in. Asia, they do okay in. Whereas Xbox is lucky. Where did I see recently that they celebrated that they had sold maybe 5,000 in Japan? Like it was a big deal.
It's low. It's low. If you looked at the week over week sales for Xbox One, literally week over week sales, it was lucky to get into quadruple digits. It was usually hundreds, if not less than 100 units. It was bad. Really bad. Yeah. And I mean, just walking into a Kojima or Big Camera or something, like a big retailer in Japan, which I've do whenever I'm there. The Xbox section is ridiculously small. It looks like the Vita section looks like in our GameStops now, where it's the tiny little one that everybody ignores off on an end cap. And, up until a year ago, Vita still had 6 or 7 rows of things, whatever, shelves of things that you could look at. And even that's kind of tapering off a little bit now. It's sad. It makes me sad.
Yeah. Well, I think that's going to do it for that. I don't know, unless either one of you has anything else you want to add. I think we've hit a good stride there in having that discussion over a plethora of things, really, between Vita and handheld and remote play and streaming and the future of stuff and just, as a whole. So I don't know if either one of you had anything else you want to kind of cap that off with. I'll take that as a no.
I think I've said my piece.
Not a problem. Well, Josh, we appreciate you stopping by and hanging out with us today.
I appreciate you having me.
We'll definitely do this again. Josh you can find him. I'll tell you what, I'll let you do. Why don't you go ahead and plug where we can find you and you mentioned the YouTube channel earlier. If you want to mention that and where we can find you on Twitter and where you're most active, I think is probably there, I'd imagine.
Well, Twitter is where I tend to be the most active, and you can find me at at Joshua M. French, my full name. And I do have a YouTube channel called The Remote Player, obviously named for my affinity for remote play using the Vita. But The Remote Player actually does more than that. I talk about, at least conceptually, I talk about Vita, Switch, GPD Win, any sort of handheld or off-screen play. So I've got that on YouTube. I've got The Remote Player there. And then, of course, using hashtags Vita Island and Switch Core are two of my big things. Those are my two communities that I'm completely active with. Switch Core is only a month old, but we've done a lot of great things with it. Vita Island is a hardcore bunch that I can never get tired of being around. That's how to find me. Mostly Twitter interactivity using that at Joshua M. French, but I mean, I've got other little offshoots to that.
Yeah, so definitely reach out to him. He's a great guy to chat with, and we appreciate you stopping by, Josh, and giving us a little bit of different topic for this week and being able to touch on this. And we'll definitely, as we go through the next year, towards the end of Vita's life cycle, we'll do this again and kind of talk about what we think is next for the Vita once production has stopped and if it'll continue to have, because PSP had a long lifespan even after after they kind of gave up on it. So we'll kind of check back in then and see what's going on. So guys, thanks again. Matt, thanks for joining us as always.
Certainly.
Couldn't do this without you.
Thank you very much.
And until next time, guys, game on.
Game on.
I'm Joshua Michael French, and you're listening to We Are One, and you are not, and you are too. We Are One, you are too. All right. I'm Joshua Michael French, and you are listening to We Are One, you are too, a PlayStation podcast. What is it? A PlayStation podcast?
PlayStation podcast.
Okay.
Yeah.
One more time. Sorry. I'm Joshua Michael French, and you're listening to We Are One, You Are Two, a PlayStation podcast.
Perfect. What we'll do is we'll throw in all three of those.
That'll be your outtakes. It's like, listen to this fool.
Oh man, good times.